Hey guys, tonight we begin with a subject both scandalous and scholarly. The intimate, confusing, and occasionally downright bizarre world of medieval sex. It was an era of chivalry and deeply suspicious herbal remedies. A time when foreplay often meant asking politely and hoping no one's watching. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest misconception. Medieval intimacy did not unfold beneath silk sheets in candlelit chambers, while a lute played softly in the background. In reality, the setting was usually a small, single-room home shared by an entire family, including children, aging relatives, a couple of goats, and a chicken who had strong opinions about personal space. Privacy, as we think of it, simply didn't exist. Most peasants lived in homes where the kitchen, bedroom, and stable were technically the same square footage, just with different smells. If a couple wanted some alone time, they had to get creative. Timing mattered. So did volume. And ideally, so did whether the kids were asleep and facing the wall. Curtains were a luxury. Beds were shared. And even among the upper classes, servants might be asleep at the foot of the bed, or standing in the corner pretending not to notice anything. Many noble households kept records of bedroom arrangements for legal or religious reasons, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Travelling also didn't help. Inns often had shared beds. That's right, total strangers might sleep side by side for the night, which made things even more complicated. Want a little affection? You better check if there's already someone in the bed, and whether or not they brought their boots. If you were married, and both parties were still awake and reasonably clean, you could share a mattress of straw and hope for the best. If you weren't married, well, you had to be twice as quiet and 3 times as careful. Communities were small, walls were thin, and gossip travelled faster than plague rats. For those living in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple. No. No privacy, no distractions, and certainly no late-night whispers. But even there, human nature occasionally made things complicated, which explains why many abbeys had unusually high garden walls. In the medieval world, few things shaped private life more than the church, and it had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to church teachings, physical intimacy had one primary function: making more people. That was it. Not pleasure, not bonding, not stress relief. Just reproduction. Everything else? Distracting at best, sinful at worst. This wasn't just Sunday sermon material. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed instructions on what was and wasn't acceptable, in case anyone dared to improvise. Certain days of the week were off limits. So were major feast days, fasting days, holy days, and, in some regions, entire liturgical seasons. Want to be close to your spouse during Lent? Think again. Advent? Also no. That left maybe Tuesdays in April. Even within marriage there were expectations. Couples were encouraged to approach one another with modesty and restraint. Expressions of affection were acceptable, but not excessive. Displays of passion were, to put it mildly, frowned upon. One 13th century guide suggested that married couples should engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, which is, by all accounts, a fairly joyless checklist. The preferred method was missionary, and not just for religious symbolism. It was deemed the most natural, and therefore the least likely to offend God, the saints, or your local priest. Anything else was considered suspect. That includes things like enthusiasm. Confession also got involved. Priests often asked pointed questions during confession to determine whether couples had broken any moral or ecclesiastical guidelines. These weren't vague spiritual inquiries, they were very specific. Sometimes uncomfortably so. Let's just say the average 14th century friar knew far more about his parishioners' bedrooms than their birthdays. Still, enforcement was uneven. Some regions were stricter than others. Some priests ignored these rules entirely, and many lay people, particularly peasants, simply smiled, nodded, and did what they were going to do anyway, quietly. If you think modern couples have trouble syncing their schedules, spare a thought for medieval folks. Planning a romantic evening in the Middle Ages required a calendar, a priest's blessing, and the luck of St. Valentine himself, who, ironically, was never married. The Church had opinions, and by opinions we mean strict prohibitions, on when intimacy was allowed. Sundays? Absolutely not. That was the Lord's Day. Fridays? Still no. Day of penance. Wednesdays? Suspicious. Add in Lent? 40 days. Advent? Another 40. Various saints' feast days, holy days, fast days, and even certain moon phases, and you'll find the calendar was less of a schedule and more of a divine obstacle course. The idea was to keep the soul focused on heaven, even when the body had other ideas. There were even lists, actual lists, of forbidden days. Some confession manuals outlined nearly half the year as off-limits. And if you were feeling particularly affectionate during one of those forbidden days, well, enjoy your spiritual guilt and an extra trip to confession. One 13th century bishop scolded a married couple for their excessive affection, which translated to more than once a month. He recommended they direct their passion toward prayer. The couple was reportedly not thrilled. Naturally, the upper classes were more exposed to these restrictions. They had chaplains, confessors, and spiritual advisors breathing down their necks. Peasants, meanwhile, had a more flexible approach. Their lives revolved around livestock, weather, and not freezing to death, which left less time for worrying about whether Tuesday was the feast of St. No Fun. To make things worse, some believed that intimacy during the wrong time could result in sickly children, divine punishment, or, worst of all, a reputation. If your neighbours caught wind that you were celebrating a little too enthusiastically during Lent, it could lead to shame, gossip, or a strongly worded sermon delivered with maximum eye contact. Romance in medieval Europe was less about falling in love and more about falling into a legally binding agreement. If you were hoping for candlelit dinners, poetry, and whispered confessions, you'd be better off reading a troubadour ballad. Real-life courtship for most people involved livestock, land rights, and two families agreeing not to start a feud. Marriage was primarily a business deal. Daughters were exchanged to cement alliances, acquire property, or secure peace between neighbours who had previously disagreed over whose pig ate whose cabbage. A bride might come with a dowry of coin, linens, or a small patch of farmland. In return, the groom's family might promise not to be entirely insufferable. Courtship, when it happened, was supervised, sometimes literally. Young people rarely courted alone. A maiden might be watched over by her mother, a stern aunt, or, if things got really serious, an entire village that was very invested in whether or not you held hands. Among the nobility, arranged matches were the norm. Kings and lords negotiated marriages like chess moves, and affection was something you developed later, or not at all. As one medieval proverb more or less stated, "Better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples." Romantic. Even among peasants, practical concerns ruled. A man's suitability was judged by his land, tools, or the size of his ox. And women? They were evaluated on their housekeeping skills, reputation, and general ability to not start drama at the market. This doesn't mean love didn't exist, it did, but it usually came after marriage, not before. If affection grew over time, that was considered a bonus, not a requirement. Think of it like medieval emotional DLC, not included in the base marriage package. Still, where there's a will, there's a workaround. Secret flirtations, playful songs, and moonlit walks to the village well became the unsanctioned side quests of medieval dating. Just be careful. Get caught kissing behind the barn, and you could face public penance, a fine, or a very disappointed father with a pitchfork. Let's clear up one of the most persistent legends about medieval relationships: chastity belts. Yes, you've probably seen them in cartoons, historical dramas, or very unfortunate museum gift shops. Those iron contraptions allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war, leaving her physically and morally sealed. Except, not really. There's no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, most examples we have today come from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, periods more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually happened. Many of these belts were created as joke items, warnings, or museum curiosities, not functioning devices. Medieval manuscripts, which often record all sorts of uncomfortable details, are suspiciously silent about mass belt distribution. No tailors advertised them. No laws regulated them. No churches handed them out during awkward marriage ceremonies. It's almost as if, and stay with me here, they weren't actually a thing. Which makes sense, because the design is wildly impractical. Medieval hygiene was already questionable. Now imagine adding a rusty metal contraption with no user manual, and a padlock that probably required a blacksmith. It would have caused more infections than it prevented indiscretions. So where did the myth come from? Likely from a combination of later moral panic and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors loved the image of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fit their narrative. And nothing says virtue like a literal keyhole in your underpants. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and more effective means: shame, surveillance, religion, and strategic matchmaking. Noblewomen were often chaperoned within an inch of their lives. Peasant girls had entire villages watching them like unpaid private investigators. And any whiff of scandal could lead to ruined reputations, lost dowries, or awkward confessions involving phrases like, "at the edge of the barley field." In a surprising twist that would shock many of their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels. In many cases, they regulated them. That's right. In several parts of medieval Europe, especially urban centres, brothels operated as legal businesses. Town councils licensed them, charged taxes, and even designated specific red light districts, long before the light bulb was invented. Some cities went as far as employing officials to manage them. These lucky souls were known as brothel keepers, or more colourfully, keepers of public women, which sounds like a very stressful line on a resume. The rationale behind this arrangement was pragmatic, if a little cynical. Officials believed that allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins, like adultery, assault, or, heaven forbid, dancing. Regulated brothels were seen as a necessary evil to keep society orderly, much like traffic signs or the existence of turnips. The church, of course, wasn't thrilled. Officially, it condemned the entire practice. But unofficially, many clergy turned a blind eye. Some even collected rent from the very same establishments. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You've grasped the essence of medieval theology in practice. Working in a brothel was no fairy tale, but it wasn't necessarily a life of constant misery either. Some women chose the profession for economic reasons, especially widows or those without family support. Others were coerced or trafficked, particularly in port cities, where sailors brought in coin and complications in equal measure. There were even handbooks. Yes, actual handbooks, for how these houses should be managed. Clean sheets, basic health inspections, and set hours were all part of the regulation process. Patrons came from all social classes: knights, apprentices, merchants, even monks, despite vows that strongly suggested otherwise. Entry fees varied, services were catalogued, and in some cases, customers paid in eggs, wool, or whatever awkward barter they had on hand. Medieval tinder, it was not. Let's set the scene. Candlelight flickering, a soft breeze through the thatched roof. Your beloved whispers, sweet nothings, and then removes their wool tunic to reveal a powerful medieval musk. Because when it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had, Priorities. Staying clean was on the list, just somewhere after surviving the plague, fixing the roof, and catching the pig that got into the pantry again. Bathing did happen, but not nearly as often as modern noses would hope. Peasants bathed infrequently, maybe once a month, more if they fell into a river by accident. Soap was either homemade or imported, expensive, and used sparingly. And while public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, they were sometimes banned during outbreaks of disease or scandal, or both. If you were wealthy, you had options. A hot bath could be drawn, scented with herbs, and followed by being rubbed with linen cloths by attendants. If you were poor, your sponge bath involved a cold bucket and the vague hope that nobody would notice your aroma over the stables. To add complexity, water itself was occasionally viewed with suspicion, especially cold water. Some believed bathing too frequently could weaken the body or open the skin to illness. Others simply didn't have the time, or the tub, or any water that wasn't already being fought over by the local geese. Now, imagine trying to impress someone under these conditions. Perfume? Mostly for the elite. Deodorant? A dream of the distant future. Dental care? Well, you might rub your teeth with ash or chew mint leaves if you were fancy. Kissing was certainly an adventure. Clothing didn't help. Layers of wool, leather, linen, and fur trapped heat, sweat, and every scent you encountered during your day, including the contents of the chamber pot and the mystery stew. And yet, people still found ways to fall in love, flirt, and get close. Perhaps our standards were different. Or perhaps, when everyone smelled equally awful, love was truly blind. And nose blind. In medieval Europe, controlling the size of your family was a bit like trying to steer a cart with no wheels, no reins, and a particularly uncooperative goat. Technically possible, but not something you could count on. To be clear, people did try. Just because contraception wasn't effective by modern standards didn't mean medieval folks were oblivious. They were very much aware that certain behaviours led to babies, and many went to elaborate, if occasionally baffling, lengths to prevent it. Some of the more scientific methods included herbal mixtures, animal membranes, and rituals that involved burying certain objects near the doorstep. One popular approach advised drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Others recommended wearing amulets blessed by someone who hopefully wasn't guessing. A few guides even claimed jumping up and down vigorously after intimacy would help, which, if nothing else, probably burned some calories. There were also early versions of barrier methods, though calling them reliable would be generous. Linen soaked in various concoctions was one approach. A few brave souls tried wax. And there are scattered references to, let's call them medieval prototypes of what would later become familiar latex devices. But don't ask how they were made. You really don't want to know. The church, of course, was not amused. Any attempt to avoid conception was often labelled sinful or unnatural. Procreation was the stated goal of marriage, and anything that got in the way of that divine mission was frowned upon, or more commonly, denounced loudly from the pulpit. Still, not everyone followed church guidance. Among married couples, particularly those struggling with poverty, the desire to space out pregnancies or avoid another mouth to feed was very real. And among unmarried couples, let's just say the motivation was even stronger. But no matter the method, reliability was low. Birth control, such as it was, depended on folk wisdom, local herbs, and a surprising amount of hope. And when it failed, which it often did, well, that's where hasty marriages, hidden pregnancies, and a lot of awkward conversations came in. Despite what church authorities liked to pretend, not every medieval couple waited until the wedding bells rang before getting cosy. In fact, the practice of testing the goods before marriage was, well, common enough to require a lot of paperwork. Known as fornication in church records and getting ahead of yourself in everyday village gossip, intimacy before marriage wasn't exactly rare, but it was definitely monitored. In towns and parishes across Europe, local officials kept moral rolls, which were less like diaries and more like ledgers of shame. If a couple was caught, or even suspected, of jumping the marital timeline, they could be hauled before the local court and fined. Sometimes the fine went to the church, sometimes to the town, and occasionally to someone who claimed to have witnessed the event. Medieval snitching was alive and well. Fines varied depending on whether it was a first offence, whether a pregnancy resulted, or whether the couple eventually got married. In some cases, getting married after the fact erased the fine, kind of like retroactive permission. In others, the fine was still applied, but at a discounted rate. Early bird penalties, if you will, and let's not forget the social consequences. In tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. So even if your local priest was feeling merciful, your neighbours weren't. Gossip could spread faster than a poorly stored meat pie in July. Interestingly, many of these situations resulted in something called hand fasting, a sort of informal engagement where the couple considered themselves betrothed and, in some regions, that was legally enough to begin cohabiting. The church later tried to tighten that loophole, but in the meantime, a lot of medieval babies were technically early arrivals. Among peasants, this was all handled with a bit more practicality. If a couple was clearly serious and a pregnancy had occurred, marriage usually followed, sometimes hurried along with a gentle nudge or firm push from both families. Among nobles, however, consequences could be far worse, especially if inheritance or reputation was on the line. In the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a virtue, it was a contract clause, a political tool, and occasionally a community-wide obsession. Among the peasantry, expectations varied by region and circumstance. A young woman was generally expected to arrive at marriage untested, at least officially. But if she didn't, well, some eyebrows would rise, and a small fine or shotgun wedding might sort things out. For the upper classes, though, things got serious. Noble women's virginity was directly tied to inheritance, alliances, and family honour. A broken engagement might spark a feud. A pregnancy out of wedlock could derail generations of planning. So how did they verify it? Well, badly. Sometimes it came down to vague testimony and character references. She seemed virtuous, or she avoided the stable boy mostly. Other times, more invasive methods were used, like midwives or matrons inspecting for the infamous hymen, which science has since confirmed is not, in fact, a medieval chastity barometer. But that didn't stop anyone. There were also attempts to prove virginity after the wedding, such as displaying a blood-stained sheet, like a very awkward medieval Yelp review. This tradition, while not universal, was expected in certain regions, and if the sheet stayed clean, cue lawsuits, annulments, and family drama on a scale rivaling a royal soap opera. Men, of course, were under no such scrutiny. Male virginity was considered an optional bonus. A future husband's experience level was rarely questioned. At most, he might be encouraged to avoid tavern maids or loose company, but no one was checking his laundry the next morning. Virginity was also linked to religious symbolism. Maidens were often praised as pure vessels, which is beautiful in theory and incredibly uncomfortable in practice. Young girls were raised with saintly ideals, often featuring horrifying martyrdom stories. And if a marriage was annulled on the grounds that a bride had been dishonest, it didn't just ruin her, it could drag down her entire family's honour and property claims. So yes, in medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just about morality. It was legal currency. If you're wondering whether same-sex attraction existed in medieval times, the answer is a resounding yes. Human nature didn't start in the 20th century, but if you're wondering whether it was openly accepted, that's where things get complicated. Medieval society was structured around religious doctrine, social roles, and property rights, and all three had a lot to say about who could love whom. Spoiler alert, it was usually a man and a woman within marriage, preferably for the purpose of making more villagers. Officially, same-sex intimacy was labelled a sin by the church, often lumped in with other unnatural acts, like dancing on feast days or reading too many books. Punishments varied wildly depending on region, time period, and who was involved. A peasant couple might get a scolding and penance. Nobles, they might face exile, or quietly be ignored if they had enough land. But while the church thundered from the pulpit, real life was messier. We have records, poems, letters, even legal documents that show emotional, romantic, and sometimes physical relationships between people of the same sex. Some monks wrote love letters to each other in Latin that sound suspiciously less brotherly and more longing. Noblewomen sometimes shared beds and declared exclusive devotion in terms that would make a troubadour blush. Medieval Europe also had social structures that blurred lines. All male monasteries and all female convents created deep emotional bonds. Knightly brotherhoods were full of vows and affectionate language. Some historians debate whether these were romantic, platonic, or something in between. But either way, there were feelings involved. And possibly poetry. As for terminology, the modern concept of sexual identity didn't exist. You didn't come out. You just lived, carefully, quietly, and often coded in allegory. There were no pride parades, but there were songs, saints' stories, and suspiciously intense pilgrimages taken in pairs. Adultery in medieval Europe was a bit like handling a live chicken while juggling knives. Risky, loud, and likely to end with someone losing a bit of pride, or property. Let's be clear, adultery wasn't just a personal failing. It was a social offence. Marriage was seen not only as a holy sacrament, but also a legal contract, a property deal, and often a strategic alliance. So when someone strayed, they weren't just breaking hearts. They were tampering with inheritances, dowries, and the always fragile local gossip equilibrium. For women, the stakes were significantly higher. A married woman caught in an affair could face public shaming, loss of dowry rights, forced penance, or even exile, especially if she had the audacity to get caught with evidence. Adulterous noblewomen might find themselves imprisoned, divorced, or, in extreme cases, discreetly removed from court life. Think less scarlet letter, more scarlet exit. Men, on the other hand, got more leeway. A married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be seen as morally suspect, but not legally punished, unless the woman's family had powerful friends or the church was feeling unusually righteous that week. That said, not all adulterers got off easy. Some towns imposed steep fines or required public confession. A few legal records include creative punishments, such as parading through the village in nothing but a shift or having to pay for a new church bell, because nothing says divine justice like bronze acoustics. The real danger, however, wasn't always the law. It was the husband. Honour killings weren't unheard of, particularly among nobles. If a cuckolded man discovered his wife's affair, medieval custom sometimes allowed him to take appropriate action. The definition of appropriate, of course, depended heavily on his status and how many swords he owned. For the wealthy, things could spiral into full-blown scandals, duels, annulments, or decade-long family feuds. For peasants, the consequences were usually financial. A fine here, a goat forfeited there, and a permanent place in village gossip. In medieval Europe, the idea of consent existed, but not in the way we understand it today. It wasn't about mutual respect or enthusiastic yeses. Instead, it was tangled in law codes, dowries, church doctrine, and the occasional shrug from society. Let's start with the basics. Medieval canon law did recognise the concept of consent in marriage. In fact, a marriage was considered valid if both parties verbally consented, even without a priest present. That's right. Two people saying "I will" in a field somewhere could technically be married. Romantic? Possibly. Legally confusing? Absolutely. But here's the rub. Just because consent was acknowledged in theory doesn't mean it was respected in practice, especially for women. For noble daughters, consent often came after arrangements were made. Families negotiated marriages like peace treaties. The young lady's opinion might be politely requested, or strongly implied. But in the end, the dowry talked louder than she did. For peasant women, choices were broader, but still pressured. Saying no to a match could mean economic ruin or social backlash. Saying no to the local Reeves' son? Riskier still. Inside marriage, consent became even murkier. Husbands had legal rights to their wives' bodies, and denying them could be grounds for complaint or annulment. Some church thinkers argued that spouses owed each other the marital debt, which sounds like a joint checking account, but was actually far less voluntary. Still, the picture wasn't all grim. Medieval courts did prosecute cases of coercion and assault, especially when witnesses were available or the accused didn't have powerful friends. In urban centres like London or Paris, court records show women and men bringing forward complaints, sometimes winning justice, or at least making a public stink. And let's not forget the literary side. Medieval tales are full of complex dynamics. Courtly love poetry, for example, often danced around consent, with knights pining, ladies refusing, and everyone dramatically swooning. If nothing else, they knew it was important to ask, even if they ignored the answer. If you ever felt like the medieval church had a complicated relationship with physical pleasure, you're right. It wasn't just complicated. It was borderline suspicious. And that suspicion extended right into the bedroom of every married couple, where the church preferred, ideally, that nothing too enjoyable was going on. To be fair, the church didn't outright ban marital relations. That would have been a logistical nightmare for inheritance, population, and, well, humanity. But it did strongly recommend moderation. Extreme moderation. Like, once a month, in the dark, no smiling kind of moderation. Theologians of the time praised celibacy as the highest form of spiritual discipline. Saints were celibate. Monks and nuns took vows. Even married couples were encouraged to live in continence, abstaining entirely, especially if they were older, holier, or simply tired of each other. A couple who voluntarily gave up intimacy was praised as being halfway to sainthood, or at least halfway to separate beds. Some church thinkers like St. Jerome went even further. He argued that even within marriage, desire was a weakness. Marital relations were acceptable only for procreation, not for fun, not for bonding, and certainly not because someone looked particularly fetching in their woolen nightshirt. This attitude filtered down into confessionals and moral manuals. Priests were instructed to ask married parishioners if they had been too lustful, even with their own spouses. Picture the awkward silence that must have followed that question at the altar rail. And yet, people still lived their lives. Most peasants, merchants, and even nobles nodded politely at the church's teachings, then went home and did whatever felt right between chores, taxes, and the odd peasant uprising. Let's be honest, after a long day threshing barley or settling land disputes, a little affection probably felt more comforting than shameful. But for the truly devout, celibate marriages were held up as models of spiritual partnership. These were couples who lived together, prayed together, and considered carnal urges a thing of the past, or at least a thing better left to younger, less holy villagers. After everything we've covered, arranged marriages, fines for flirting, herbal birth control, suspicious bath habits, and church warnings against smiling too much, you might be wondering, did medieval people actually fall in love? The answer is yes. Awkwardly, passionately, and sometimes even happily. Despite the rigid social structures and moral sermons, love found a way to bloom in the cracks. Peasant couples courted in fields and marketplaces, trading favours, flowers, and whispered gossip over turnips. Noble lovers exchanged poetry and secret glances during formal banquets, while pretending to care about hunting falcon breeds. Monks and nuns wrote letters filled with emotion that modern readers still debate. Was it spiritual longing, or something more? Literature from the period is bursting with romance. Troubadours sang of distant ladies who inspired knights to go off and get very dramatically injured. Stories of courtly love glorified longing from afar, especially if you were pining for someone married to your boss. Sure, the love was often unattainable, But hey, that's where the best verses come from. In some cases,